email each of you, there we go. We'll email each of you a link to the recording so you can share it with your colleagues. And that link will also have the full presentation slides, including the appendices. The webinar will also be published on CILTNA's social media feeds. Okay. So what do we hope to accomplish here today? Well, first of all, we would like to give you a little bit of background on why supply chains react and often overreact the way they do, a little bit of supply chain science, if you will, and give you some tips on how to recover your supply chain in the face of these many disruptions that we've been facing. And then third and finally, give you some ideas about how to make your supply chains more resilient against future disruptions. And if there's one thing that we've learned in 2019 and especially in 2020, it's not a case of when disruptions, I'm sorry, it's not a case of if disruptions will occur, it's a case of when. So the program sets up as a series of 2 or perhaps 3 webinars, depending on the feedback that we receive. And this is a very important point. We're really counting on your completion of the survey results. We'll circulate the survey to you via email immediately after the webinar. And that serves 2 purposes. It will set the agenda for future webinars, and it also is the entry point or the gateway point for consulting opportunities that those of you in the Toronto and Vancouver areas may wish to take advantage of in following this procedure. Those are offered by the 2 colleges that are partnering in the webinar. So hopefully we'll be able to give you some ideas about diversifying your webinar or your supply chain, from moving from a just-in-time supply chain to a just-in-case supply chain, and building some optionality into your supply chains. And just to reinforce the point I made a moment ago, the survey is very, very important, both as a driver of the future webinar content and as the entry point to the free student consulting offered by BCIT and Seneca. And Jackie will speak more to the student consulting opportunities in a moment. So just who the heck are we? Well, our principal speakers today will be Professor Jim Wire from the School of International Business Management at Seneca College, and Professor Jackie Lee from the British Columbia Institute of Technology. John Coleman has been sort of our eminence grise in terms of some of the supply chain science material that we'll be presenting, and I've tried to pitch in a little bit here as well. Our CVs are appended to the presentation, so you'll receive those when you receive the link to the webinar recording. Those of you who suffer from insomnia will be able to make good use of them. Suffice it to say at this point that between the 4 of us, we've got about 135 years experience in the supply chain business and all the scars to prove it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim to talk a little bit about supply chain structure, risks, and supply chain behavior. So go ahead, Jim.
Well, thank you, Paul, and welcome to our participants. To begin, let's just do a quick review of a typical manufacturer and retail supply chain. As you look at the manufacturer supply chain, some quick observations. Each link typically has inventory, and each link is serviced by transportation. But a unique point is that each link has its own unique supply chain. Keep that in mind. Now let's quickly look at the retail supply chain. Again, similar to our previous supply chain that we have, but you notice an additional link. We have a distributor. I also have in the bottom there a silhouette of an aircraft and a container ship. That's to represent the international component that you may or may not have with your supply chain. And of course, with that, you have more potential participants, one being CBSA, that's Canada Border Service Agency, involved in this supply chain. Wow, so many moving parts. So what could go wrong? What could go wrong? Let me sum it up in one word: disruption. Let's take a look at some of the results of disruption. There we go. It's coming. Inventory sitting. Each link, as we've previously mentioned, has inventory. And if it's sitting, it's not generating profit. Shipment stopped. Products are not being transported. Lead times become disjointed. Potential congestion at ocean and airports, truck terminals, and railheads. Your DC, distribution center, or your warehouse storage facility may become unavailable, or they may be under or overutilized. That's costing both time to resolve and loss of customer orders, if not loss of clients. On the financial side, invoices are not being generated. Vendors still want to be paid. Now let's go to the end, to the customer. Meeting the customer's needs. Well, your customer relationship management team or person now takes on a much more critical role in communication, not only with the customers, but also with other links in the supply chain. A question for you. Can you see any areas of concern you might have in your business? Yeah, just dwell on it for a quick moment or so. Okay, we'll come back to it maybe in a form of questions. Well, these days, you hear how pandemic is the creator of disruption, but could you also have local or regional disruption? Yes, you can. Let's take a look at some Canadian-made disruptions. CN, okay, potential strike. What about that blockade that came on? What about lockout notices? What about slowdowns in other sectors that we have? What about Mother Nature? And I'm going to do something I promised I would not do during the summer. I'm going to say the S word. Mother Nature, snow, snowstorms, rain, sleet that happens. What about accidents on the major arteries, be it highways, railways, that happen? Okay, disruptions. And here it comes. The pandemic has magnified how disruptions have either reintroduced or, for some people, introduced new types of risk associated with supply chain. Let's take a look at some of the common ones that have been highlighted. And again, this is not a complete list. So, lack of cash. Guys, lack of cash, if you don't have it, then you are finished. Okay, cash flow has to be determined for daily operations and payables. Okay, what about the tactical approach to determine responses? If you haven't got a team to review risk and what if scenarios, think of creating one quickly. What about receivable risk? You should plan to be proactive and engage and communicate with your clients to understand what are their financial positions and what ability to pay. Now the big one. Transportation risk, the huge contributor to your costs and risks. Before stating obvious risks, some risks can sneak up on you. For example, consider this scenario. A tropical storm batters the northeast coast of the US, damaging homes and other structures. So what? I'm here in Ontario, or in BC, Manitoba, Quebec, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia. Okay, so what? Now, you and or your vendors import, export to or from the US, you may find it hard to have your shipments moved by truck, as there may be more of a promise of guaranteed work and higher rates for truckers as they become part of the rebuild in the affected area. So what? Truck capacity shrinks, rates start to rise. What about inventory risk? A subtle one, input shortage. The cap that goes on to the water bottle. Okay, without that, no production happens. Okay, actually, Purell, the hand sanitizer company, experienced something similar to this scenario. The hand pumps, they're having a hard time getting hand pumps in, but they found some unique ways to counter this. Okay, what about your inventory that expires, or your inventory that has a shortfall against the demand that's out there? What about your inventory that's not being regularly counted? Maybe there's shortages. Maybe that's what you think. What about that inventory that's in your distribution channel that can all of a sudden reverse course and come back to you? Let's look at supplier risk. Let's revisit the cap. Why don't you have these caps? A financial problem with your supplier, or is there a financial problem in the supplier's supply chain? What about the quality, compliance, and delivery that you were expecting? Country risk. Those that do international trading. Political, economic, commercial risk. Need I remind you of what happened when Trump turned around and increased the duty rates on China products up to 25%? That sent shivers down the spine of a lot of supply chains. Contract risk. Now is the time to flip over your contract and start reading some of that fine print, looking for words like penalize, penalties, interest rate, or force majeure. Force majeure is the unforeseeable circumstances that prevent fulfilling of a contract. Now, some 3PLs, third-party logistics company, and carriers have already canceled delivery guarantees. And they are now allowing for surcharge or even new rates to replace that without any recourse until you start your rate negotiations again. This brings us to workforce risk. Are your laid off trained employees coming back? What about your management team? Things to consider. So let's just take a quick look at how supply chains behave, or the behavior of supply chains. Every supply chain becomes a complex system. So to state the obvious, although we're concentrating on your supply chain and your supply chain concern, we must remember that each link in the supply chain also has its own supply chain. So when you have a percentage improvement in one area of your supply chain, okay, it doesn't mean you're going to have that same percentage of improvement in the balance of your supply chain or the other links that you have. And why is that? It's because you have different variables that can have an effect on some components of the supply chain and no effect on others that go on. And variables such as, for example, your client or consumer demand for transportation, fuel costs, congestion, warehouse space, and the list continues on. So, supply chain behavior, that is a resultant of your customized system demand, what you want for your supply chain. Adding to that the collective behavior of all the other links that go on there. They're all the other parties to the supply chain. Now, in turn, that is your supply chain behavior. Okay. Now, we've talked about variation. Let's talk about its twin, its cousin, constraints. A quick example of constraints is the water bottle. 500 milliliters of water are in here, but it has a bottleneck, and a bottleneck is another name for constraint that restricts the flow. So this is a positive constraint that has on there. As we turn to industry, some constraints you may have is raw materials from your suppliers, maybe transportation, maybe your plant capacity, okay? Maybe financial. These are all types of constraints that can turn around, and when coupled with variation, becomes the culprit in most supply chain problems. Okay. One thing you should be aware of also is that as you take care of one constraint, one bottleneck, sometimes what happens, you have another one that percolates or pops up in another part of the supply chain. So always be vigilant to realize that. And sometimes the reason for that, it may take time. Maybe the variable has to be a little more depth to it to affect another aspect of your supply chain. Let's talk about dependent events. And the best thing to do is just, let me give you an example. Okay, our final product is the water bottle. So part of a very fairly simple fill rate is that the plastic bottle is placed onto or into the system. That's one dependent event. It goes and gets a label on it. That's another dependent event. It goes and gets filled with water. That's another dependent event. It goes and has the cap put on. That is another dependent event. And so when we talk about dependent events, before the cap can go on, they've got to have the water bottle full. So it's dependent upon the previous operation that we have. There are positive and negative variances that do come about, which we've indicated some, and these could affect each dependent event. Now, can you see how negative variances might affect each dependent event in your company? How about negative variance effect on production and inventory? Dwell on that for a moment. The bullwhip effect. Guys, there was a run on toilet paper. Yes, toilet paper. Newscasts, videos, and pictures were showing empty grocery store shelves. Now, the manager of the grocery store says, I can't have empty shelves here. In turn, I'm going to put a larger order into my wholesaler so this doesn't happen again. The wholesaler turns around and says, well, I deal with a lot of grocery stores. So I'm going to turn around and I'm going to put in a larger order. And with that, to the distributor, sorry, I just lost my train of thought when I just, to the distributor. So the distributor says, well, I've got a lot of wholesalers out there. So I'm going to turn around and put a larger order into the manufacturer. The manufacturer says, wow, I got to see what my capacity is. I got to see what variances that this has created. So with that, we now look at the lead times. The manufacturer says, I need a week to produce. I need a day to ship to the distributor. The distributor says, well, I need a day to receive, and then a day to ship it to the wholesaler. The wholesaler says, I need a day to receive, and a day to ship it to the grocery stores. The grocery stores, well, I need a day to receive and a day to stock the shelves. Now, that takes 13 days, everything else being equal, no more disruptions. But during that time, the run on the toilet paper starts to subside, diminish. And now we're finding that each link in the supply chain now has excess inventory, taking up space, costing money as it sits at each link. The bullwhip effect. My wife loves this. She has a sort of a sixth sense of knowing when this is happening, and she'll wait it out until the prices come down, because to get rid of excess inventory at the retail level, sales. So transparency and communication is essential between your links. Okay. Well, my gym talk is over, and now I would like to reintroduce Jackie Lee from the British Columbia Institute of Technology to discuss supply chain recovery. Jackie.
Thank you, Paul. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Jim. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. I can see your laughing reaction. That means you guys can hear me. Welcome to the webinar, and I'm going to talk about the supply chain recovery, how we should take actions against disruptions in supply chains. What we can do after emerging from the pandemics is, first thing, do not destabilize your complex supply chain system, because your supply chain systems is designed to best use your existing suppliers, customers, and resource. So your systems is designed based on a certain amount of throughput. When you are trying to stretch your systems or shrink your systems, you are disrupting the entire supply chains, not only to yourself, but also to your supply chain partners, such as your upstream supplier and the downstream customers. And try to run safely below your maximum capacities. So when the demand increase, you have some room, you have some wiggle room to adjust your production schedules. And be careful not to generate big ripples in your supply chains, because when you generate a ripples, just like the bullwhip effect suggests, the ripples will get bigger and bigger going down the supply chains. And be careful about finding a fault with others. We'll talk about that in a later slides. Currently, everybody is suffering from the supply chain disruptions, and we are all doing our best. So you need to give them goodwill. And second thing, as Jim mentions about in the supply chains, we have many dependent events. At every step, try to reduce the negative variance. so that your system can work at the optimum capacities at the optimum delivery speed. The system has been configured for a certain throughput, as I mentioned. Reducing the variance could smooth out the kinks and making the delivery without mistakes or without errors. Deal with variance and constraints. As Jim mentioned about the water bottles. The water bottleneck, as the bottleneck suggests, is your constraints. And bottleneck work as a regulators of your flow of your goods and products. So it helps to slow down the process, or sometimes it creates congestions in your supply chains. So try to minimize variations at the constraints as your priorities. Identify your constraints in your operations and try to build a trusting relationship with your supply chain partners and try to find out a way to bust the constraints so that it makes the constraints at the optimum capacities as it can. Try to help prevent bullwhip effect. Now, as Jim mentioned, bullwhip effect, it starts somewhere and it ripple down. It ripple down the supply chain. So as part of the supply chain participants, you might want to ask your suppliers as well as your customers, are they okay, or would it help to order a smaller batch or smaller order of products and take more frequent delivery? All right. So adjust your size of your orders, either from the supplier or send out as your shipments to your consumers, and ask them if they are willing to take a smaller orders but more frequent delivery. Don't try to bunch up end of month sales or purchase just to meet quotas, because it will create a big ripples down the supply chain. Stabilize the price fluctuations. When the supplier sees that there's a huge demand coming down the road, what they will do? Well, they will have to schedule overtime, and it will increase their operating costs, and they will try to increase the price to pass down the cost to consumers. And you might not want to engage in a phantom orders. So what phantom order is, you really need 100, but in anticipating your supplier might only can get you 90s, you inflate your orders by 20%, and hopefully you will get 100. This is a phantom order. Only order what you really need without inflating the numbers, because when you're inflating the number, you're creating the bigger bullwhip effect down the road. Be careful about ordering same thing from many suppliers. So if I have A, B, and C suppliers, I send a purchase order to supplier A for 100 units, and that's exactly what I need. And it seems like suppliers are getting back to me very slowly and with some hesitance. And I would place another orders to supplier B and supplier C, hoping that one of them will get back to me with that amount. Now, try not to do that. Again, by doing this multiple orders for the same thing to different suppliers, you are creating a bigger bullwhip in the supply chain. Optimize. Every organization has a constraint somewhere. And just like I mentioned, constraints work positively and sometimes negatively. And try to maximize the throughput through your constraints, and find out what is the high margin product mix you can put through your constraints. And try to work your constraint 24/7. Keep them busy, because your constraint is your product flow regulator. And if it's working at optimum speed, then you will get the most out of your supply chain. And once you solve the first constraints issues, then move on to the next constraints, identify the next constraints, and work the same magics. Now, we understand that we cannot offer a one-shoe-fits-all solutions. Every company faces a unique challenge. And we are just talking about the principles to solve some of the supply chain disruptions. And we often see some common problems that faced by companies. And some of the common problems are, for example, inventory stock out. An empty shelf represents a lost revenues, a lost sales. So how to tackle inventory stock out? Try to adjust your safety stock level or carry extra capacities, all right? Increase your safety stock levels to prevent any delays or transportation risk happens in the supply chain. Inventory back order, very similar to inventory stock outs. Your orders are taking longer to deliver to your door. Try to use economic ordering quantity methods to determine how much order you need to put in given the changing transit times that are in the current supply chain. Production capacity shortage. Without buying an equipment, without committing a purchase of large capital investments, you might think of sharing equipment across departments, across operating team, or leasing equipment on a temporary basis to resolve your production capacity shortage. Labor shortage. The CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefits, has provided an incentive for laborers to stay home. Without working, they get $2,000 or $1,250 from the government. So it gives them the incentive to stay home. And that, that presents another challenge to companies short of laborers. To tackle that, I would suggest companies to look at labor ready, some of the temporary labor solutions, or adding on contract workers without committing a full-time permanent positions. Supplier delivery problems. Find multiple suppliers that are in different regions and countries. I would categorize in 3 levels. Onshore, which is near your location, suppliers that are near your locations. Nearshore, that are potentially across the border in the United States or somewhere that are closer, but it's out of your regions. And finally, offshore suppliers. Somebody that, some suppliers that are located in foreign countries, overseas. And if you're buying from offshore suppliers, try to have multiple suppliers in different countries instead of putting all your eggs in one basket. And let's say if you happen to have only one major supplier in overseas, perhaps you want to come up or develop an alternative logistic plan. So instead of having 100% of your cargo on a full container load containers, FCL, you might want to consider 10% of those cargoes by air freight and then 90% of the remaining cargoes on a FCL or LCL logistic plan. So create alternative logistic plan to tackle long lead time. And finally, for transportation infrastructures. Now, this is a little bit of a macro problem beyond our control. A short solutions would be try to find suppliers that are closer to you. Find domestic supplier, onshore suppliers that are, within the same living standard or within the same countries that, we have a pretty good, very good, well-developed infrastructures in Canada. So stay local, right? That's an easy solution to that. And finally, this is my favorite. Live by the golden rule. Treat others as if you want to be treated for your supply chain partners. Recognize that we are all in this together, and everybody is trying to do their best to cope with the pandemic's disruptions. So try to give real and transparent information to your supply chain partners so that they can plan with real information, with accurate information for their master schedule productions. And ensure all the documents are provided electronically, on time, and error-free, because one single error could generate another big ripples and create negative variance in the supply chain. Pay invoice as per agreed credit terms, or talk to your supply chain partner in advance if you run into cash flow issues, so that they understand what risks they will be facing without being caught by surprise. Finally, treat your carrier with respect, because they are the ones that physically deliver the products to you or pick up the products from you. So you might want to treat them with respect. And finally, companies are run by people, and people always help friends first. So build a trusting relationship, build a good relationship with supply chain partner is most important in helping each other out of these disruptions. And next, I will pass to Paul to talk about supply chain resiliency. 1 second. Paul, please take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. Some great ideas there about working our way through the current disruptions that we're all facing in our supply chains. Now let's talk for a moment about how we can possibly mitigate against future supply chains and build some resilience. And I'll do that as soon as I get my, there we go. I'll do that now that we've got the screen moving. This is all about optionality, frankly. It's about a mindset of not only just in time, but also just in case to deal with these disruptions that, again, we've been taught are going to keep coming at us, and we've certainly seen that in 2019 and 2020. And this optionality can extend to many components of the supply chain. For example, manufacturing and sourcing. I'm sure many, if not most, North American small businesses have experienced the multiple challenges of an Asia-based supply chain. And Jim and Jackie both mentioned some of these. Trade disputes leading up to COVID, then COVID itself, which goes without saying has been a huge issue. Blanked container ship sailings, loss of air freight capacity due to the tremendous reduction of passenger air travel. So the list is long and continuing. Does the renewed USMCA offer more effective nearshoring opportunities? Would changes in manufacturing processes help reduce lead times and simplify and streamline inventory, ordering, and transportation for you? As Jackie said, every situation is unique, but we encourage you to think beyond simply a low-cost mentality and reinforce a point made earlier. We are not suggesting abandonment of global sourcing. We simply encourage the development, implementation, and periodic testing, and that's very important, of alternative sources of supply. You will likely pay a bit more for these options, but hopefully you'll be in a position to maintain at least some customer service when the inevitable disruptions occur. Another key area where optionality and diversification is important is in transportation modes and routing. And again, both Jackie and Jim have mentioned this, so I'll be brief. These are key components of supply chain resilience. While preparing for this webinar, we happened to speak with a broker in Shanghai who pointed out that all-in transit times to Central North America from Southeast Asia via the Suez and over the Atlantic were actually very similar to the traditional Trans-Pacific routings when the final destination is in Central North America. So this is an example of a different coast, likely a different carrier, different routing option that you might be able to employ. Another one is that some of the ocean carriers are developing express services, somewhat in competition with air freight services, but more really to fill the gap that this lack of air freight capacity has shown us. Not as fast as air freight, but still considerably cheaper. They developed these express ocean services by going load center to load center on the ocean, guaranteed loadings, priority discharge, expedited intermodal movement inland, things of this nature. The ability to react to transportation disruptions is where periodic testing really comes to the fore. Are your processes around shipping documents, customs, credit, payments robust? Are they scalable? It's sort of like the health authorities' advice on dealing with the COVID pandemic. You have to put the plan in place, and then you have to continuously test it to make sure that it's there for you when you need it and robust. Finally, a word on communications up and down the chain. And this is really all about developing a culture of no surprises, because a surprise is a very avoidable shock to the system that can develop into these supply chain behaviors that Jim talked about, and in particular the bullwhip effect. So you have to have that end-to-end communication, not just with your immediately adjacent supply chain partners, but partners farther up and down the chain, be they the distant manufacturers on the one side or the distant retailers on the other. Early warning systems, joint performance measures, shared triggers and KPIs, even shared electronic platforms for improving supply chain visibility and transparency. I recognize that some of these things may be beyond the interest and capability of small business, but it's that culture of no surprises, that culture of trust building and transparency that can help avoid some of these shooting ourselves in the foot, frankly, issues that we see sometimes when we're managing our way through supply chain disruptions. Now I'll turn it back to Jackie for a brief overview of the student consulting opportunities that we referenced at the beginning of the webinar. Jackie?
Thank you, Paul. We recognize that every business faces a unique challenge in these disruptions, pandemic disruptions, and this webinar is only offering a principles or general solutions. Now, your company might run into a unique solutions that might need a deeper look or closer look to the root, to identify the root of the problems. At Seneca College and BCIT, we offer a team of logistics students led by a faculties. We can send a team of those students, specialized students, to come and work with you. During September to December, 1 day per week, this specialized team can come and work with business virtually to identify issues, do the root cause studies, and do the due diligence research, and provide informed recommendations to how to solve the problems in specific companies and organizations. There's no charge for this faculty-led students consulting projects, and this project also provides a real life opportunities for students to work in companies and gain their experience before they enter the industries. However, donations are highly appreciated, and I just want to offer a example of a past business consulting project success. 3 operation management students at BCIT has found a way to save Craftsman Collisions store $600,000 cost saving a year during their BCP, during their business consulting projects. And this is only for one branch of the tens of 20 plus collisions outlets. And this success could be duplicated, and it could be, you could be just like Craftsman Collision to benefit from a cost saving from the student projects. Next, I'll pass back to Jim. Oh, sorry, pass back to Paul, sorry.
Okay, thanks very much, Jackie. So again, just to continue on the point, we are definitely counting on your feedback, not just to gain access to the student consulting project that Jackie just described in more detail, but also to get the feedback on this webinar and give us the ideas about how to, what topics that you would like to cover in future webinars. So please fill out the survey. I see that it's gone to everyone already from our very able administrator. Please take a moment to fill that out, and we'll be able to react accordingly, both on the future webinars and also on the student consulting opportunities. Okay, with that, everyone, let's turn our attention to the questions from the chat function. Thank you very much for your attention so far. Please continue to submit questions, and we'll get to them as many as we can here in the time that's remaining. So I'm going to try to find, where did my chat function go? There we go. Okay, so a question, I'll put this one to Jackie. Will student teams have access to industry or market data sources?
Students do have access to the library resource. So for some data, they are able to access. But for specific data, they might need to, it might take them a longer time to respond. But I would say they are, general data or industry data are available to the research team.
Okay, great, Jackie, thank you. Just a comment from Yuri. Again, concerning the student consulting, calls it a great initiative. It bridges practice for students and aid to small business owners. And Yuri offers congratulations to both BCIT and to Seneca. An admin type question from Nancy. Are you going to send a link to the student consulting? Actually, Nancy, when you open up the survey, you will see a place there to indicate your interest in the student consulting, and also to enter your contact information, so either Jackie's team or Jim's team in Toronto can get a hold of you as appropriate. So that's where that link would be will be found. Please keep the questions and comments coming via the chat. In the meantime, we've got a couple more here, and John Coleman, I think I'll direct this one to you. As managers look upstream and downstream in their supply chains and see hiccups and disruptions in both directions, should they concentrate on solving upstream problems first or downstream? So John Coleman.
Gee, Paul, I was hoping you would answer that one. I don't know. What's your take on it?
Well, I would look upstream first, I think, because I'd want to make sure that product was coming in. I mean, if I had a massive inventory of finished product ready for sale, if I was a retailer and there was something blocking that sale, then sure, I'd look downstream. But I think the more typical problem is going to be getting my semi-finished goods and my raw materials into my producers in order to build up that inventory that I've got available for sale. I think my ongoing sales, whether I've shifted to an e-commerce type of option during these pandemic times, or kept my stores available as turning them into brick and mortar delivery points as opposed to stores. There's all sorts of things I can do downstream, and I think I deplete my inventory quite quickly. So I think my main focus would be upstream to make sure that I can continue creating that inventory and moving it out that way.
Yeah, it's upstream where the problems in the bullwhip effect originate, and they transmit downstream from upstream. So if you're seeing variation, lots of it, and problems and constraints and orders and phantom orders, probably best to start hunting upstream. So good thoughts, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, another one, and again, we've got about 10 or 15 minutes here, folks, so please make sure to submit any questions or comments via the chat. Here's one from Marion Robson. In this COVID climate, many small and medium-sized enterprises are facing severe financial issues and can't pay their bills. How should they deal with suppliers and other supply chain partners? Marion, I'll take a first run at this, and then I'll turn it over to either Jackie or Jim. Main thing, I think, and I think it was mentioned, is that you can see these things coming, and this gets back to the issue of a culture of no surprises. Everyone understands, I think, in these days that cash is going to be an issue for many, many businesses, especially small and medium-sized ones. So the key thing is, when you don't hold back, when you see that start to happen, you talk to your partners up and downstream, whatever the case may be, and say, look, I'm not going to be able to pay you based on our current terms. However, I do have a strong market. I am able to supply customers. What can we work out here in the short term so that I can keep in business and keep supplying and make sure that I get my money to you as quickly as I can, even though it won't be on their current terms. So it would be, again, a case of no surprises, let them know in advance, communicate with them, try to find a solution. Jackie or Jim, any other comments on that?
Yeah, I agree with Paul 100%. And this pandemic situation is evolving, and I would anticipate there are more and more financial products coming online, new financial products coming online to solve those short-term cash crunch issues. Important thing is you got to work with your supply chain partners, because one of your retailer or one of the supply chain partner fall, it could ripple effect to yourself. So helping them to continue the operations, it's actually helping yourself. So there is vested interest for everybody in the supply chain to help each other. So I think there should be, if there is, I mean, if it's not available right now, I think it will come out in the financial markets, that new products to help this kind of situations. So keep your eyes on the, with your bankers and your financiers. I think they could give you a better suggestions here. Jim?
Yeah,
Any suggestion?
Yeah, I agree with the comments that being made with it. This is an opportunity also for banks and other lending institutions to garner more business. So as Jack, as you point out, there are new products that are being discussed and being brought out. Maybe some industries may look at forming sort of a co-op, and when they're approaching the financial question, so they have more power in numbers and that go on. So there are different ways of doing business, just to be a little more inventive, but there are some options that are out there. You start off at the very beginning, communicate with your customers, okay, find out what their situation is, then you can sort of garner what action you can take. Maybe it'll be a payment plan, okay, over a period of time, okay, or every quarter there's payments made. So there's different options that can be had, and it's no simple answer, but it's to customize it would have to be down to the SMEs and their clients.
Yeah. Oh, excellent, guys. Here's one that I think I'll direct to Jackie. Would you recommend this is from Colin Laughlin, would you recommend retailers curtailing end customer hoarding, and the example being the whole toilet paper issue, or does this in fact create a false forecast for suppliers?
Wow, good question, Colin, and very practical as well. So setting a purchase order limit on customers. I personally do not endorse such solutions. However, I know that it's a very effective way to stop those hoarders or stop arbitrators that buy in bulk and then try to Amazon it at the retail level at multiple times profits. And I think transparency by the retail store is very important. Like for example, Costco could put out a public post at the door. I think they might have already done it to announce when would be the next delivery order coming in. And I think large retail chain has been doing their best to mitigate this surge in demand. They try to keep it transparent. So they let the consumer knows that when the goods will come in, and when the shelf will be filled at a certain expected time. So keeping the information transparent and publicly available to your customers, it will help out to ease the urge or some of the insecurities, feeling of insecurities of not getting the product they want. And so informations, again, communication, transparent communications would be key to solve this, rather than putting a authoritarian solutions to curtail the purchase order. I think that's a little bit how do I say, it not only it might hurt the image of retailer a bit, because somebody like, for example, BCID would need thousands of paper rolls and they are being limited for the purchase, which is not the optimum solutions, I would say.
Okay, very good, Jackie.
Thank you.
One from Andrew Young, and I'll direct this to Jim Wire. When a supplier invokes force majeure, this has been a tactic to buy time or to completely break a has this been a tactic to only buy time or to completely break a contract? How should small companies address this if it happens within their supply chain?
Question. And there is no one simple answer for it, but maybe some guidelines is that force majeure, if it happens, it is up to the company that's requesting force majeure to qualify that there is a discrepancy, there is an unforeseeable circumstances to enact it. Because the law itself just says that you just can't turn around and say, hey guys, force majeure, you've got to have reasonable grounds for it and proof, because it can be indeed brought to court. It can't be a tactic that is used to break contracts per se. So the best advice would be, based on the circumstances, is to talk to a lawyer, because that's what it comes down to, is those legal terms. And it can be a tactic that can be used for clients, but depends on how large your relationship is with your clients, as far as financially, as far as what percentage of the business that they have for you. All those factors, you look into it. Because when you have force majeure that goes on, hopefully, as Jackie's mentioned, that you've already had communication with them. You're already seeing what's transpiring, and you can see that the ripple effect is not only them, but in Wuhan, when they shut down the ports and the airports, you can see it sort of coming. So you've got to be that sort of visionary that something's going to happen. And ignoring it and then seeing the result of it is part of what we talked about being tactical. If you have the what if scenarios and you see something like the ports being closed, you should be asking yourself, what is the effect this could have on my business? And it's the ripple effect. Maybe you're not the importer, or maybe your vendor is the importer. So that's an effect on your business. So the force majeure aspect, again, is there are degrees of force majeure that can happen, but it's more, again, in the legal aspect that you have to redefine. If someone's coming down on you, this is a legal recourse. It's just not a word they can use and say, okay, next. It's something that you've got to prove to you.
Right.
Question.
Oh, great, Jim. Here's a question from Clinton, very interesting. Supply chain stakeholders need to have incentives to enhance the collaboration during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. The question is how to use the powerful visibility network to sensing the risk disruption signals and getting fast responses without compromising the supply chain reliability. I'll take a bit of a run at this, Clinton. Again, you're spot on with your comment here. It is about transparency, visibility, and a culture of no surprises. So a big part of it is simply that communication piece. I think large customers working with big carriers, like coal companies working with the railways, for example, it's worth everyone's while to invest in shared platforms where you see the inventory at the mine and the inventory at the port and the number of ships coming and the empty trains and the loaded trains. And I know CN and I'm sure CP has done that. A little bit out of reach probably for small and medium-sized businesses. But the whole notion behind it, the notion of communication, shared measures, shared trigger points where a certain measure is being hit, then you've already discussed in advance with your supply chain partners what actions we're all going to jointly take together to protect what's most important to all of us. And as Jim pointed out while discussing supply chain behavior, what's important to everyone in the supply chain is throughput. Throughput. Move the most goods through as smoothly as possible in a planned and forecasted and hopefully low-cost way. So it's communication, trust, the culture of no surprises, and sharing that information as soon as it becomes available. And that really goes back a little bit to the previous question as well, is accurate forecasts. It's up to the it's up